We are all concerned about the industrial way of life and its negative impact on the natural world. As we weigh in on the consequences of our actions and whether or not industrialism has a sustainable future, our discussion today is aptly titled, Too Much, Too Little, Too Late. I'm Zoe Kaufman, publisher of Truth Dig. Welcome to our event. In this discussion, moderated by Christopher Ketchum, the curator of our Dig series, Green Tinted Glasses, we will explore the challenges of economic and population growth as they relate to renewable energy sources. Chris is no stranger to Truth Dig. He is a self-described roving journalist, essayist, poet, and amateur naturalist who covers public lands and environmental issues, and has written extensively on the conflict between the industrial way of life and the natural world. As an author, he wrote the book, This Land: How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West. Joining him are panelists who span the worlds of math, physics, and chemistry. Dr. William Rees is a human ecologist and an ecological economist. He is the former director and professor emeritus of the University of British Columbia's School of Community and Regional Planning. Nandita Bajaj is the executive director of the advocacy group Population Balance, and she is an adjunct lecturer at the Institute for Humane Education at Antioch University, where she teaches about the perils of pronatalism, human supremacy, and human growthism. Rex Weiler is the co-founder of Greenpeace International. He is a writer and ecologist who advocates for degrowth. We'd like to thank the panelists for sharing their expertise on these critical and alarming issues. And thank you, Truth Dig audience, for your continued support of our thought-provoking events as we discuss the significant matters of our time. I'll hand it over to you, Chris.
Okay. Hey, great to be here. Bill, Rex, Nandita. So this is a subject dear to my heart, as you know, something I've written about many times, the question of whether industrial civilization can be made green, quote unquote, sustainable, ecologically sane. And it seems to me that the evidence to date suggests the answer is no. But what do I know? Maybe I'm a cynical journalist, and maybe there are hopeful signs out there that we could alter the seemingly suicidal trajectory of a techno-industrial society. The Iroquois didn't seem to think so. I want to read to you guys from a little passage from the 1977 Basic Call to Consciousness from the Iroquois Address to the Western World. And part of it reads, "Today, the species of man is facing a question of its very survival. The way of life known as Western civilization is on a death path, on which their own culture has no viable answers. When faced with the reality of their own destructiveness, they can only go forward into areas of more efficient destruction." So my first question is for you, Bill. Are we on a death path?
Are we on a death path? Well, yeah, we are, obviously. I think if current trends continue, there's very little contradiction to that fact. We're in a state of overshoot. Overshoot means that human beings are using even renewable resources faster than natural systems can regenerate, and we're dumping wastes far in excess of the capacity of natural systems to assimilate and circulate that waste. And if you think about it, we're essentially turning the ecosphere, the living film on the surface of this earth, into more human bodies and human infrastructure, our artifacts of civilization. This is, frankly, a terminal process if it continues indefinitely. So that's the technical answer to your simple question. Yeah.
Okay, so what about the Green New Deal that's supposed to save this whole system and make it renewable and sustainable? I mean, we talk about the green transition, but the green transition seems to ignore that we're already using 1.75 Earths of renewable resources every year. And that's based on the average consumption of 8 million human beings. So obviously, a green transition would require reducing our total ecological and material footprint. Yet mainstream environmentalism doesn't talk about that. Mainstream environmentalism instead focuses solely on climate change without situating it in the broader perspective of it being just one aspect of ecological overshoot. So why are we fixed obsessively on carbon emissions and climate change rather than looking broadly at overshoot?
Well, I think the simplest answer is that humans don't think broadly at all. We tend to forget that we are an evolved species, that in fact, the human brain evolved in a period of relative simplicity. We lived in very simple societies. You met relatively few people. You lived in a restricted home range, which could become very familiar. And over the course of an individual lifetime, not much changed. So you could argue that, in effect, the environment posed relatively few real challenges to the developing human brain. Yeah, we've got a big brain. Yeah, we can think in analytic terms and so on and so forth. But we do not think in systems terms. We tend to think simplistically. We look at one problem at a time. We tend to look at simple cause-effect relationships. So when you put us in the context of global change, climate change is an obvious symptom of overshoot, but it's one of many problems. It's what I call a co-symptom of a meta-problem, the meta-problem being overshoot. But it's something that's manageable to the average human being, so that we think we can deal with this problem. The symptoms are obvious, perhaps the causes are equally obvious. So we jump onto a simplistic solution to a very complex problem. And the problem is that if we succeeded in doing a green energy transition, nothing else would change. You see, energy is the means by which humans have appropriated all of the other resources needed to explode the human enterprise in just the past 200 years. So if we shift energy sources without changing our habits or values, we'll simply continue down this path of devouring the planet and converting it to human artifacts and human bodies. So it's no solution at all. Besides which, it's biophysically impossible. So that's a whole other answer to a
Well,
question.
and you've written a lot about that, about the biophysical impossibilities of a renewable energy being able to power this energy ravenous dynamic civilization. Can you just briefly tell us about that, about the limits to the limits to renewable energy in the context of in a civilization in which we all want lots of power and always more power in terms of energy, in which we want to travel and eat meat and become affluent and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, you've described, again, some fundamental dimensions of evolved human nature. We are acquisitive. We are consumers by nature. We want stuff and we want it now. Of course, that's all reinforced by a cultural paradigm, which has really trained us to be hyper consumers on, I don't know, whatever drug you want to think about. But look, the impossibility is simple. First of all, we're on a very serious time frame here. Right now, despite everything we've heard about the explosion of renewable energy, particularly wind and solar power, these are the two major forms of alternative green energy, so-called, into which investment is going. In 2022, that's last year, the last year for which we have complete data, wind and solar provided about 11.5 or 12% of the world's electricity. But electricity is only, 18 or 19% of final energy consumption. So wind and solar gave us 2.5%, maybe 2.3% of our total energy supply. Now, if that's after 30 years of rapid growth and development, if you thought of that in the terms that we're speaking here, well, we need to carbonize by 2050 or whatever people are saying these days, it's an impossibility theorem. It can't happen in that time frame. In any case, in order to do it, requires a massive several hundred % increase in the mining activity for several rare earths and minerals. This causes massive ecological damage, not only at the mine site, but because of the refining, transportation, manufacturing, and so on of all of this infrastructure. Think of replacing most of our currently fossil fuel-based infrastructure with a comparable quantity of material running on electricity, and it becomes a problem of astronomical proportions. You'd be recreating industrial civilization in the next 2 or 3 decades. Again, it's not going to happen. And if it did, it would be a disaster. In fact, I've sometimes said that the only thing worse than the failure of the green energy transition on a finite planet would be the success of the green energy transition, because it would simply enable the behemoths human system to overwhelm the planet.
The what human system?
We're a behemoth, superorganism.
Behemoth. Yeah. Behemoth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
The juggernaut.
It's just a word that came to mind as I was.
No, it's a
here.
good word. It's perfect. It's perfect. It's the juggernaut. It's Lewis
That's
Mumford's mega machine. It's the or Homo colossus, as William Catton described it. Right. So,
but one other thing is important here, and that is people think simplistically, and we think we can handle the climate system. If we were to shift to thinking about overshoot, it becomes impossible to imagine that we can change that. It would mean real change. You see, the beauty about the climate focus is that because we have such a technology fix and a romance with this notion that the greatest resource is the human mind, the capacity for technology continuously to replace any entity provided by nature, then the climate thing seems solvable. Whereas if you switch to overshoot, it would mean we'd actually have to change things. We'd actually have to do something very differently. I mean, you mentioned at the outset, we'd have to shrink our ecological footprint. Listen, the only real solution to overshoot, by definition, is a large reduction, a massive reduction, in fact, in what we call economic throughput, the consumption of energy and material. And since all of it goes through the system and emerges as entropic waste, a huge reduction in the production of waste materials as well. That means a contraction of the human enterprise, which is why Rex is very much, well, all of us, I think, here are concerned about degrowth. We cannot sustain the current human enterprise, which is a energy and material consuming, I'll use the word behemoth.
Mm-hmm. So Rex and Nandita, the issue here is growth, right? And that the system that prioritizes growth and that can only function through further growth. So, for example, Nandita, your expertise is population and population ecology and demographics. Some people have reported that the population growth dynamic in which we're embedded and which so many people say is a wonderful thing. More people means bigger economies, means more consumers, means more dynamism, more creativity from the human brain. And I know from personal experience that the human brain isn't that great, right? So why aren't we talking about population as a key driver in the growth dynamic that is fast leading us towards this cliff?
Well, I think you've mentioned one of the key reasons why we're not talking about population is because population growth benefits a lot of power structures who can rely on the growth of people. And yet, population over the last 3, 4, 5 decades has become extremely controversial as a subject. There's been a real silencing of the population factor, even though some people are okay to talk about the reduction in the need for reduction in our consumption. The very word population brings up the history of coercive population policies for a lot of people, like the China's one-child policy, but that is not the full story. Like you mentioned, Chris, if you look deeply at who is served by the silencing of the population discourse, you see its true roots. Deeply entrenched pronatalism. Pronatalism is a combination of patriarchal, religious, nationalistic, economic pressures that are placed generally on women to bear children in order to grow these power structures. A growing population ensures you have a steady supply of cheap labor, more consumers, more religious followers, more taxpayers, a larger military, a bigger tribe, and so on. And, pronatalism has been around for as long as we've had patriarchy, at least 10,000 years. And it has flourished completely unchecked for millennia. But it's really what Bill was talking about, the growth in the human enterprise that's happened over the last 200 years on, fossil fueled industrialization, that we've really expanded our population from 1 billion to 8 billion in literally just 200 years, when we've had hardly any growth in our population for 250,000 years. So that's a massive, massive expansion. And of course, we've had a huge consumption increase during that time, though unequally distributed. There's a lot of socioeconomic issues and equity issues there. But that aside, population is still not talked about. But when we did, in the 70s, when we did start talking about population as a real core issue that needed to be addressed in order to address poverty, in order to address ecological degradation, there were a lot of bodies, the UN, NGOs, international, governmental support to institute family planning programs that had incredible effect in empowering girls and women to have greater reproductive choice, to take control over their own reproduction. And we saw a rapid decline in fertility rate. And yet there were some of the policies that used coercive measures because people lacked imagination in what was really needed to, cause a decline in fertility, which was to confront patriarchy. But interestingly, what I want to say is around that same time, due to the rise in feminism, the rise in ecological movement, it already started to threaten a lot of the power structures that were in place. And in response to that, there was a rise in this free market fundamentalism and religious conservatism that started to push back against these population policies because they were not to benefit from the population growth that they had for so long. And free market fundamentalism was really premised on this idea that population growth is necessary for economic growth. Especially, it allowed rich countries like the US to exploit the resources and labor in poor countries. And these family planning programs were having the opposite effect. And then religious fundamentalism, especially with huge interference from the Vatican, opposed birth control, abortion, and similarly vilified these programs. And they've been extremely successful in kind of using this broad brush of labeling all population policies as coercive. And ironically, they were the ones who popularized the term neo-Malthusian, which is now being thrown around by a lot of liberal left media, who has also bought into this growth mantra to shut down.
I've been called a neo-Malthusian.
I think we all on this call have probably been called. And you can see the UN has bought into this. The UN, under its sustainable development, the most oxymoronic phrase, has adopted this growth mantra, where it's now pushing for more industrialization, more green tech, more green, agricultural revolution, without recognizing that it's eating right out of the hands of the very people who, subjugate the reproductive rights and the feminism that they were trying to fight for.
So So on the note of, on the question of why population is addressed, say in the major media and even the minor alt media in the United States, why is it that folks like me and so many of the editors I deal with, right, are loath to talk about population? It's not that I mean, I don't, let's say I'm a typical journalist working the field or a typical editor, and I'm like, nope, can't go there. Well, okay, why can't we go there? Because I don't stand to benefit, or it's the average editor doesn't stand to benefit in any way from not talking about population or facilitating more population growth. So what is it? What is it? Why is this subject verboten?
I think, again, this pro-growth, economic growth model that was pushed forth by market fundamentalists entered demography and that conversation that somehow countries need economic development and industrialization, the kind that we've had in Western countries, in order to develop. And then automatically, when countries develop, their fertility rates start declining. Well, that's completely false because recent data actually shows that fertility decline, wherever it has happened as a direct result of family planning programs, of empowering people to make autonomous reproductive decisions, not because suddenly they've got refrigerators and cars, so they're going to have fewer kids. People have fewer kids when they have the power to choose. And
when you say people, you're talking about women. You're talking about
yeah, exactly.
women.
I'm talking generally women who, I mean, you look at countries that still have the highest fertility rates. Same countries have the highest rates of child marriage. Same countries, highest rates of unmet need for contraceptives because of patriarchal and religious barriers. Same countries have the highest rates of child labor exploitation, of lots of other subjugation, like sexual subjugation of women and girls. So this idea that somehow more development is needed is a Western ideology, really a form of neocolonialism that allows rich countries, to continue to just steal, land grab, and steal the resources and labor from these countries. And I think the left liberal media commentators have unfortunately bought into that same growth mentality and bought into this idea that somehow talking about population means we're targeting people to reduce their fertility when they don't want to. Or to use coercion somehow to reduce fertility rates, instead of the very opposite thing. All contemporary population rights advocates are really talking about exactly the opposite, is confronting patriarchal norms. So girls and women actually have a say on what they do with their lives and their bodies.
Mm. And in terms of that history of coercion, doesn't it really come down to two examples: sterilization briefly in India and the one-child policy that you mentioned earlier in China? But for the large part, or in large part, the population stabilization programs all across the world that began in the 60s and sort of had their high point, I guess, the 70s and 80s. These were not coercive, and they were largely successful, and they were in many ways embraced by the broad population of these countries where population or fertility reductions were achieved. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you're very right, Chris. Yeah, I think it's more than maybe those two examples. There were, a few other examples where coercion was used. But your point about the vast majority of population policies being voluntary, non-coercive, empowering, and having seen a rapid decline in the empowerment of the girls and women, and a decline in fertility, was a result of these voluntary programs. But most people just remember the China's one-child policy. And guess who popularized that notion? The people who benefit from population growth: market fundamentalists, religious conservatives. If you Google the phrase Overpopulation is a myth, and I encourage viewers to do that. Look at what are the top searches that come up. American Enterprise Institute, Cato Institute, Breakthrough Institute, all these libertarian think tanks, Catholics, etc., the Catholic Anti-Choice Institute, all of the same bodies that have popularized the notion that free market economy is what's needed for the globe to succeed, loathe the idea of population reduction.
So years ago, when I was working on my book about the American West, I interviewed a wonderful bear biologist named David Mattson, and he and I we had wide-ranging discussions. And one thing he said was he was so disgusted with how the environmental movement had begun to embrace market fundamentalism, and that he got into environmentalism, or really got into ecology, because he believed that it signaled a path forward towards an actual transformation of our politics, a transformation of our politics away from capitalist growthism, human supremacy, and the ambition that we shall dominate and subjugate the entire natural world for the benefit of the one holy chosen species on Earth. So Rex, I want to ask you, is this an act? Is my friend David Mattson's portrait of how environmentalism has gone astray accurate?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's at least partially accurate. It's essentially accurate, yes. There are still some serious ecologists in the world, but I think the environmental movement overall has kind of lost the thread of real ecology, and part of it is because what you allude to, which I call human exceptionalism, which is this notion that human needs are always trump any ecological need. We need to build more homes. We need to grow more food. We need to create more gadgets, more comfort, more pleasure for 8 billion humans, which will soon enough be 9 billion, 10 billion, and there's no limit. And I mean, nobody likes limits put on themselves. So I understand this psychologically, and it goes back to what Bill was saying about how simplistically we typically think. We don't think in complex systems. So we don't want to set limits on ourselves. We don't want to say there's anything we can't do if we want to. But in fact, from an ecological point of view, there's lots of limits on every living creature on Earth. And ecology is filled with limits, and all creatures have to deal with those limits. Part of the reasons I think that environmentalism lost the thread and has drifted toward sort of market fundamentalism is, well, it's part of the natural evolution of new and creative and important ideas. If you look at look what the Catholic Church did to the teachings of Jesus. If you look at how the status quo eats everything. So look at what happened to the simple idea of sharing the resources, which was the idea of socialism and communism. Of course, that turned into giant bureaucracies, ideologies, violence, and horror shows. So it's not just a right-wing capitalist problem. It's also left-wing ideologies too, because they are both ideologies that embrace human exceptionalism and industrialism.
Yeah.
And environmental groups feel like, well, they've got to raise money. They've got to keep their constituents happy. They don't want to raise issues like population because there'll be a sector of their constituencies that will interpret that as being anti-human, anti-people, If we talk about population, we're setting limits on people, and that sounds like an anti-liberal idea. So you have liberal ideologies that won't talk about population. We know why the conservative ideologies won't talk about population, because population growth, they think that's the road to more wealth. The liberal ideologies don't want to talk about population because it's because people are afraid that they're going to be accused of being anti-human or blaming the poor. That's one thing I hear a lot. Oh, well, you're blaming the poor for our problems. It's just the rich people's consumption that's the real problem, and that's partially true. That's the problem. Yeah, it is partially true that the consumption of the wealthy nations is a huge issue, but sheer number, 8 billion humans on the planet, is also an issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bill?
I'd really like to add to that, because if you think of the 8 billion, about a quarter of humanity right now has caused most of these so-called environmental problems that we're confronting. They're not really environmental problems, they're cultural problems. They stem from a set of beliefs, values, and assumptions that I think we've all alluded to. The growth ethic is embedded in the Western mindset. And we know from neurological experiments that once ideas are repeated over and over and over again, they literally form synaptic circuits in the human brain, which causes people to seek out reinforcing of those same ideas. So we've got a situation which is self-reinforcing here, and we tend to deny or forget any kind of contrary information. So it's a cultural problem, not really an environmental problem. When we're concerned about the so-called environment, we have to recognize that there is no environment, that human beings are part of a matrix, of a living film on the surface of the earth. Each of us on this panel contain atoms or molecules once that roamed the prairies of North America or Asia in the bodies of dinosaurs, that the fabric of life is continuously recycling. We are part of this entity called the ecosphere, if you want the technical term. But the point of the matter is that humans are just one of thousands of so-called consumer species on a finite planet. And the simple fact of the matter is that all of that life depends on a finite throughput of photosynthetic energy captured by green plants. Most of it. There's a bit of chemosynthesis going on as well, but it's mostly photosynthesis. The more humans there are, the higher our life standards, the higher we eat on the food chain and so on, the more of that photosynthetic throughput humans appropriate for themselves, and the less is available for the rest of nature. So we are literally competitively displacing non-human life from the fabric that sustains us, which is an insane situation, but that's what we're doing. And we have to recognize that in natural systems, a balance is maintained between the growth of any one species population, and the negative feedbacks that hold it in check. So every species, including humans, is capable of exponential growth. But in nature, we're kept in a fluctuating equilibrium with changing ecological circumstances. So in times of when resources are abundant, we grow a bit, then we're slammed down when resources get scarce or disease kicks in, or we become attractive because of our numbers to predators or whatever it might be. But something unique happened with human beings in the early 19th century. And that was the discovery of how to use fossil fuel. I think we forget this in our culture, our utter dependence on fossil fuel. So Nandita mentioned that we've expanded from 1 billion to 8 billion in just 200 years. Well, that's 1 over 1,250th times faster than the first billion. So in just a fraction of human history, we expanded to 8 billion people. 10 generations of humans have experienced sufficient continuous growth to notice it. That's 10 generations out of thousands. And yet our culture has taken this to be the norm. when this period of consumptive growth, consumptive meaning that we're growing, but we're consuming the rest of the planet, is the single most abnormal period in human history. And it resembles what I call a one-off population plague phase of growth. Other species go through fluctuating populations in nature. Humans have done this now on a global scale. We are eroding, look, we're up there at 8 billion with all of our infrastructure and cultural artifacts, but it's all sustained on a fountain of fossil fuel. So if you were to cut that fossil fuel immediately, say in 10 years, the entire system would collapse on itself. It is being sustained by this enormous throughput of energy, a one-time gift in the form of fossil fuel, which is why we're struggling to try to find a substitute to maintain that system up there. But it can't really happen on a finite planet. And I think that's the simplest message we can bring to you. It's a finite, in fact, it's shrinking because of the consumption of humans are inhibiting the capacity of the planet to maintain its historic levels of bioproductivity. And pollution is destroying much of the remaining productivity. Most people don't think of it, but climate change is a waste management issue because carbon dioxide is the single largest waste product by weight of industrial economies. And it's simply symbolic of the incapacity of the natural system any longer to assimilate the full volume of our wastes. So it really is an insane situation that we are in denial of, absolute denial of.
So what you're describing, though, it seems to be an intractable problem certainly without any easy solution. And to Rex's point about where environmentalism has gone astray, what I've noticed in interviewing folks from mainstream environmental NGOs is they want to have some sort of effect. They want to feel like they've got donors giving them money, and so they want to show that they've done something and they've made some sort of beneficial change to the world that then justifies all the money coming in from the donors. And I, as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, I can guarantee you that from my work as a reporter, I have changed nothing. Zip. My articles have had zero effect on the broad trajectory of society. Maybe I've changed a couple of hearts and minds here and there, but so I recognize that almost the futility of fighting against the mega machine, against this juggernaut that is fueled by fossil fuels. And absent fossil fuels, what do you have? You have a catastrophic contraction of economies and populations that will be, of course, politically unacceptable. And it's, Bill, you had a great line in one of your essays that goes something like this: the politically expedient or the politically feasible is ecologically irrelevant. Correct me if I'm getting this wrong. And the ecologically relevant is politically impossible. And it seems that that's where we're stuck, really, when you get to the heart of it and you look honestly at the ecological world problematique, right? So, Bill, talk a little bit about that, about the politically feasible being ecologically irrelevant. And again, maybe I got the phrase wrong.
No, but you're basically correct. We know what we should be doing to solve this problem, but we can't possibly grasp that nettle because it would require massive changes to our population policies, to the industrial infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So what is ecologically necessary is simply infeasible politically. I can't get a good discussion of these issues going on any of the major CBC channels, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation channels that I communicate with some regularity. They won't touch it. It's just not politically expedient for them to do so as a public broadcaster. So we're in that kind of trap. But look, it's really important to understand that what you're dealing with here is, again, a problem of human cognition. We don't live in reality. One of the characteristics that really distinguish humans from other species is that we socially construct stories, paradigms, cultural narratives, and then we live out of those narratives as if they were true. And so once we're embedded in one of these narratives, anything that contradicts the directions the narrative is taking is simply ignored. And that's why you and I and Rex and Nanda are having virtually no influence on what's going on out there in the mainstream, because there are billions of dollars being spent every year to reinforce the mainstream narrative that growth is good, that more is better, that we're all in a game here, and the best way to solve the poverty problem in developing nations is through further economic growth. Because, we wouldn't want to share. But, even if you have a very slim sliver of the economic pie, if that pie gets bigger and bigger, that little wedge gets wider and wider at the margin. And so if we grow the economy big enough, everybody's going to have more than sufficiency. It's a wonderful story. And as I said, humans live out of their stories. They do not live out of the contrary reality. So as long as you can tell comfortable people, and I'm speaking now the consuming populations of the West, that they don't have to do anything. That's us. Yeah. That we can remain in our current exalted position materially, and the rest of the world can grow to catch up with it. That's a wonderful story. Why wouldn't I want to believe that? Instead of a story that says you've got to look, in the West, we'd have to cut back 80% of our material consumption in order to equilibrate across the world.
God forbid.
Absolutely. And even if everybody lived in total equity, if we were all equal, all 8 billion of us, we'd still be an overshoot. So that's not enough.
Yeah. So and we've known about all these issues of overshoot. We've known about the destiny that Homo sapiens, growthist, technological, industrial Homo sapiens faces, given the limits of a tiny planet. We've known about this since the 1972 Limits to Growth report laid it all out before a world audience and sold millions and millions of copies, right? The team of researchers at MIT concluded, yes, we have to stop growth, and then there has to be an equitable distribution of existing wealth. Well, problems, because once you start demanding an equitable distribution of wealth, you're talking about revolution. You're talking about political change that is just a tearing up of existing political infrastructures, a collapsing or destruction of existing ideology, which is revolution. So is there any revolution on the horizon?
It may be what's necessary. Look, when Limits to Growth was published, I had a stack of papers 2 feet high on my desk that rejected limits to growth, mostly written by economists.
Yes.
Because the economists are profoundly dedicated to 2 propositions. First, that the economy is completely separate from the ecosphere. And that's absolutely ridiculous presumption, but most of their models are based on that presumption. The second is that technology can substitute for nature. And the main criticisms of Limits to Growth were based on the fact that they didn't take into account the evolution of technology. That technology would solve all of these problems. So within a couple of years, Limits to Growth disappeared. However, there have been now at least four that I'm aware of, independent studies of how the real world has behaved compared to the projections of the so-called base case scenario of the Limits to Growth study. One of these studies just came out last week, I believe. All of them confirm that we're on track for a major contraction of population and economy sometime later in this century. So I think the Limits to Growth study was rejected prematurely. It was a simple, primitive perhaps, but realistic. One of my computer science professors told me it's always better to be approximately correct than very precisely wrong. So economists develop marvelously intricate, complex models that are precisely wrong. I think Limits to Growth is roughly correct.
So Nandita, let's talk about what's overarching all this. What's behind all these collective decisions we make to embrace growth, to embrace technology as a savior. Does it all come back to human supremacism and this idea that we're the chosen ones, where the God has smiled upon us? I mean, you go back to Genesis. Was it Genesis 1:26? And the Lord said, "Thou shalt rule over everything that crawleth on the earth and have dominion over all living things." Lunacy. And yet hell, you talk to the average person. The average person will tell you exactly what Bill said, or what Rex was saying, what Bill has been saying, that human beings deserve all our comforts and pleasures and conveniences and rising affluence at the expense of all our brothers and non-human brothers and sisters in the wild world. So, for example, between 1970 and present, we've lost 69% of all vertebrate populations on the earth, which is an absolute holocaust. This is a catastrophe if you care about other than human creatures. If you don't, then you look at the aisles of Walmart and Whole Foods, and you say, wow, we're doing great. Look at all this abundance. So talk to us a bit about human supremacism and how this, to Bill's point, human supremacism is a construction of reality.
Absolutely.
But it's a false construction of reality.
Yeah. And you described it really well, Chris, and also Rex and Bill have alluded to it. Human supremacy, the idea that we are this most superior species to have ever existed on the planet, and that nature and the non-human world simply exists to serve us. And if it doesn't benefit us immediately, then we have all the power prerogative to kill them, dominate them, whatever it is that we need to do. They're simply there for us to, commodify as resources, as Bill said, to turn into human artifacts. In fact, you brought up kind of Judeo-Christian ideology that we think led to the worldview of human supremacy. It definitely contributed to the modern worldview of it. But I think it goes back even further. I think 10,000 years ago, when we first started the agricultural revolution, when we first started, domesticating animals, and went from gatherer-hunter societies to more settlement societies. And that's where the idea of domination over animals, over nature as property, animals as property, women as property, people with lower socioeconomic status as property, the enslavement, basically all of the different versions of social, economic types of oppression, the systems of oppression that exist today, including militarism, started with the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. And the other thing we often think is somehow it's a religious fundamentalist idea that human supremacy has become the dominant worldview. Science played a huge part in buying into that. The Cartesian scientific philosophy, I think, therefore I am. And because animals don't think the way we do, because nature doesn't have the capacity to think like we do, we can just appropriate and exploit it. It's just there as a machine, as a human colony. So I think much of the science that is actually being produced is perpetuating that dominant worldview. And then, of course, we've had thousands of years of exploitation and the genocide of indigenous communities, where we have totally lost that connection of reverence and respect to the non-human world. And now I'd say there's been a global brainwash through imperialism, through colonialism, where really the modern human civilization across the globe, for the most part, believes in human supremacy, with small communities, that are still protected from that, who are living in kind of a symbiotic relationship.
So very, very quickly, you reminded me when you're talking about how science has also helped maintain this false reality of human supremacism. There's a great essay by Lynn White Jr., The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, from I think 1966 or 67, in which he basically said, okay, when science developed under the Baconian principles in the 1500s, 1600s, what it did is it appropriated, it basically took the mandate from Genesis and then secularized it, and basically said, okay, we're going to maintain this dominance without a religious veneer. And White's thesis was hated because so many scientists said, no, we're totally objective. What are we talking about? Well, I think in fact he was correct. So Rex, a question for you. You have talked about the need for environmentalists to radically disrupt the growth machine. How do we do that? Are there practical ways? I mean, you can, I don't know, street protests, sabotage, conversations like this that hope to change people's minds. I don't know. I mean, like I said, I've been writing about the subject for a long time. You guys have been working on it even longer collectively. To what effect?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And, I've been involved in ecology efforts for 50 years. I can't say I'm pleased with the speed of change. Of course, I'm not. So what can we do? Well, first of all, toss out the taboos against even talking about these issues about overshoot and population. Let's at least have the conversation. I don't care where you stand on the issue. Let's talk about it. So in our media, in our environmental groups, in our liberal institutions, in our financial institutions, let's have the discussions, first of all. And then let's also think of some metrics. If we look, and this is what makes me concerned, is if we look at any significant metric to measure the health of our ecosystems on Earth, they are all worse than they were 60 years ago when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, right, or 50 years right. ago when I and my friends started getting involved with ecology and created Greenpeace. Let's look at the metrics. Let's measure and we have the so-called 9 boundaries, ecological boundaries, but we've already exceeded 6 of them. The nutrient cycles, phosphorus and nitrogen, have been exceeded. Climate health has been exceeded. The land changes have been exceeded. Species diversity and health, which you've already talked about, biodiversity, we've exceeded that ecological boundary. Freshwater depletion and pollution, toxins in our environment, and what is called novel entities. That is all the toxins, the endocrine disruptors, the plastics. I was just reading an article about plastics in the belly of camels dying in the desert, and it goes on and on. And then the other 3 so-called boundaries, ocean acidification, aerosols, and ozone depletion, are all on their way to being overshot. So we've overshot all of these boundaries, and we're not talking about it. We're talking about solving climate change by making more gadgets, by making more windmills.
Because there's money to be made. Because there's a lot of money.
I'm not against windmills and solar panels, Christopher. I think that's a good idea. But Bill has pointed out, right now we have a 19 terawatt global economy, and 2.3% of that is powered by wind and solar. We're not getting there. And at the rate we're building wind and solar, it would take us, I just did the calculation a few weeks ago, at the rate that we're actually creating wind and solar, it'll take us 20,000 years to create that 19 terawatts. And in the meantime, we keep growing that 19 terawatt demand.
Look,
so we're not solving the problem. So first thing is, we have to accept contraction, which Bill has talked about. We have to accept contraction. We have to accept that human population is a real issue, as Nandita has mentioned. We have to accept that we have to contract human enterprise at the largest scale, and we have to have these conversations. And the environmental groups and the politicians and the economists can't create taboos around even talking about this stuff.
Yeah, well.
And then we have to take action. But we have to take, for example, with the population issue, for example, we need universal women's rights, and we need to fight hard for that. We need to fight hard for universal contraception available everywhere and free and cheap. And just those 2 things, and eliminate all unwanted pregnancies. Just doing that, we could actually reverse population growth into a decline. But we're not doing these things because A, we're afraid to even talk about it, and B, we have powerful forces that want the population to grow and want the economy to grow. So there's lots of things we can do, Christopher. We're not doing them, and we're not talking about them. We're fooling ourselves. So it's like the addict. We've had 36 climate meetings in 44 years, and the human carbon emissions have doubled in that time in 36 meetings. It reminds me as if you had a friend who was a drug addict and they went into rehab 36 times over 44 years and their drug intake doubled. Wouldn't you recommend they try something new and different?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
What Rex is talking about is the power of our mindset, this socially constructed alternative view of reality. And as long as we live out of that view of reality, all the facts that Rex has talked about and that we've been discussing here make no difference whatsoever. What is the point of facts if you're living out of a fantasy? And I can't emphasize this enough. People simply do not realize the extent to which we've been brainwashed, literally, into believing in a certain way of being on this earth, particularly in Western techno-industrial society. And it's deliberate. I mean, if you look at the history of this whole neoliberal way of thinking back from the late 60s and early 70s, one good starting point would be an essay called, I can't even remember what it's called, but it was basically an essay to the US Chamber of Commerce, saying that, look, feminism and environmentalism are threats to the...
It's the Powell memo.
Oh, that's right.
The Powell memo.
The Powell memorandum, which you can download online, instructing the industrial heartland of the United States to start funding economics departments or professorships or think tanks. And then somebody mentioned a whole list of think tanks, all of which sprang out of the urgings of Lewis Powell's memorandum to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So we've been literally millions and millions of dollars put into the social construction of this growthist mentality, which acts as a kind of intellectual shield against contrary information. So the data, I mean, that Rex has talked about at length, simply does not penetrate. If you believe something profoundly enough, it doesn't matter a damn what the contrary evidence is. And belief is so powerful. I mean, religion, every religion, pardon me, I don't mean to offend anyone, is a social construct, but they're so powerful that people go to war over their social constructs with people who are genetically identical to themselves. Young men blow themselves up because of their belief in some fantasy created out of their religious ideology. Economists win Nobel Prizes out of an ideological insanity, such as the notion that, look, climate change is mostly going to affect agriculture, but since agriculture is only 2 or 3% of the economy, if we just grow for a year or two, we can overcome the loss of agriculture. I mean, that's a Nobel Prize winning kind of thesis
it's
by
William
Nordhaus.
Nordhaus, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the kind of insane world in which we live. Literally insane, because there's no sanity in the sense of paying attention to the external realities within which culture is embedded. Economic models are so utterly devoid of any important information about the ecosystems or even the social systems with which the economy interacts in the real world, that it's an insanity of humankind that we place so much confidence in economics as opposed to the real world. Yet, here we are.
In the real world, let's call it ecology, right?
All right, there we go.
But and if I could...
Real world.
Sorry.
But that is the real world. Yeah, none did it. Yeah.
If I could just add to what's happened as a result of our uncritical support of this ideology, especially on the left. And I identify as a left-leaning person, but I know this issue is not a partisan issue. This issue affects everybody. Ecological overshoot is not a left issue. Yet, because the liberal media commentators and lefties generally have silenced the issue of population, what has happened is the far right and religious fundamentalists, the market fundamentalists have swooped in to fill the void and are now creating a different kind of alarmism that we are facing a human population collapse and that we need to figure out how to put women back into their positions, their traditional gender roles, so we can convince them with baby bonuses, with abortion bans, with contraceptive disinformation, to start having babies for the economy, because economy is the ultimate measure of human success. And it represents a tremendous backsliding of human rights, of reproductive rights, of children's rights, of ecological justice, for the justice of the millions of species that have vanished, the justice for the billions of animals that are currently part of the agricultural industrial system that are being slaughtered. It makes absolutely no sense. And yet you look at some of the major media outlets that are reporting, everybody's talking about the panic of the fertility decline. This is some of the biggest left media. How are people not alarmed about the language shaming women for not producing enough babies for the economy? Why is that not being challenged? Why are we uncritically accepting this ideology?
Right. Well, let's challenge it. I mean, it's
to Rex's point, you know, we need to start talking about these things. We need to remove the taboo from academia that is no longer teaching students about population and demography or ecology in the way we were being taught 30, 40 years ago.
So let's take some questions from viewers here. One of them, I don't know if we'll be able to answer this one. Question. So what is the economic alternative to the capitalist economy that is built on perpetual growth? Can you guys come up with a whole new economy in 3 minutes?
Well, there was the steady state economy described by Herman Daly, which really, if you read that book now, yeah, he got it pretty exactly right. You know, this idea of a steady state economy goes back 150. It goes back to John Stuart Mill in England, who could see the factories growing across the landscape and realize, well, sooner, you know, capitalism's great, but sooner or later you're gonna have to stop growing. But anyway, so the steady state economy is one good, and I think Bill probably has some. Bill and Nandita probably have some ideas about that as well.
Well, look, I'm an acolyte of Herman Daly. So the steady state economy to me is certainly the most well-articulated alternative. Look, your body is a steady state. A certain amount of stuff comes in, a certain amount of stuff goes out, and it maintains yourself in thermodynamic equilibrium. You don't grow perpetually. You know, growth is normal. But it's a juvenile phase in the development of any system, including the individual body. So to put a religious tone around growth and hold it up on a throne as if it can't be disobeyed is an absolute absurdity again, but that's the way humans think. So we should recognize that societies tend to grow, but then they mature. And at that point, if they mature within the carrying capacity of their environments, however that is defined, then they can continue indefinitely without destroying the biophysical basis of their own existence. See, that's what we are doing. The current growth model literally is destroying the biophysical basis of the entire human enterprise. Now, that is an absurdity that I find almost impossible to wrap my mind around, and yet that's what we're doing. So the steady state gets around all of that. Figure out what a decent standard of living is. We know what the capacity of biophysical systems are to sustain. Do a little bit of math and you can figure out what an appropriate steady state economy might look like. Maybe 1 to 2 billion people on this planet at a reasonably decent material standard.
Yeah, but
if you lower the population, then the material standard goes up.
That's right.
For everybody.
People forget that. The more people on a finite planet, the lower the average material standard. So if you want a high standard of living, it becomes logical to reduce the numbers, not any coercive way, but through the ways that Rex and Nandita have been talking about.
Yeah. Oh, here's another question from someone named Andy Luck. Is it okay to just withdraw from the apparently futile political resistance to the machine the machine being capitalized, and just concentrate on defending what's left of wilderness in the hope that some of it survives the collapse.
Sure. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, I mean, protect every last square inch of wild wilderness. Absolutely. I don't know if it's enough. No one thing is enough, but it's certainly okay to do that.
I think it's a wonderful idea. The problem is that if the current system continues, then there won't be any real survival of significant patches of wilderness. Look, we're in an exponential growth phase. That means a constant doubling time. And the quantity of consumption that occurs in any one doubling time is equivalent to the sum of consumption that has occurred in all previous doubling times combined. People don't understand that in the last 30 years, we have using that model, in fact, it's data verified, 1/2 of all the fossil fuels and most other minerals ever used by humankind in just the last 35 years. Here we have hundreds of thousands of years of human existence, and more than half of everything important has been consumed in the last 35 years. If we double again, then that would mean, in effect, using as much material and energy in the next 35 years as has been used in all of previous human history. This is already on a world in overshoot. It becomes a biophysical impossibility. So yes, let's conserve what we can, but you won't conserve a whole lot unless you come to grips with this growth model.
So let's say, past behavior is a great indicator of future behavior, in my experience. Let's just say that our history to date, we've done nothing about these issues, and we keep on going on the trajectory that we've been on. What are the chances of a collapse in the lifetime of, say, myself? I'm 50 years old. I'd like to see it. I think it'll be exciting.
Well, it'll be exciting.
Well, I'd like to hear.
It'll be horrific. It'll be horrific. But so I'm wondering.
I'd like to hear from Nandita on this, but just let me say the collapse is already underway. The likelihood of a collapse is 100%. As to most people in the world are living in what we would call collapse conditions.
Yeah.
Billions of people living on the edge of poverty. About 10 million people starve to death every year. Humans and their livestock comprise 96.5% of all mammal biomass on Earth. Christopher, the collapse is underway, and it's not something that happens one morning when we wake up, we find out it's collapsed. A collapse can take generations. But yes. I'm interested, Nandita, what's your feeling about that?
Well, I don't have an idea on the projection of collapse. I turn to people like you and Bill to gain an understanding on that. But I'd like to reinforce what you just said, Rex, in terms of the collapse has been happening for thousands of years. I mean, this collapse is not a new thing. Thousands of different civilizations of indigenous communities have experienced collapse and genocide, and have actually, not many of them have risen out of the ashes, and some of them are living in the remnants of what we have left for them. There's been an extreme genocide of the non-human world. To Rex's point, 4% of what's left of the wild vertebrate world, mammalian biomass, is now wild, right? 4% is now wild. That used to be 99% 10,000 years ago, before we started domesticating animals and appropriating nature for our benefit. We represented 1% of all mammalian biomass at that point. Now we represent, along with the animals that we kill for food, 96%. That I agree with Rex. The collapse is way underway, and I think, in the words of another of my colleagues, Robert Jensen, all trajectories, the degrowth trajectory, where when we are looking at declining our human enterprise, whether we continue increasing our human enterprise or whether we stagnate is going to involve massive suffering. We are expecting billions of people in the next few decades to be displaced from their homes and become climate refugees. We're going to be seeing more millions of species go extinct within the next couple of decades at our current rates. I think at this point, our focus really should be in trying to avert as much unnecessary suffering as we can. We know it's baked in. We know the temperature increase is baked in. We know catastrophe and flooding and droughts are baked in. At this point, really our focus should be trying to reverse and avert as much of that as we can. And Bill's favorite, one of my favorite things that Bill has talked about is lifeboats, is for communities like ours who are really oriented around justice, ecological justice, intergenerational justice, social and reproductive justice, to try to expand our communities so that they can act like lifeboats to the sinking industrial civilization that is happening, and try to row fast enough so we don't get sucked into the eddies of that sinking ship. That's where I feel the hope lies, is strengthening the communities and the models of relocalization, of new economies, of kind of reclaiming some of the traditional wisdoms of being in reciprocity relationships with the non-human world.
I think it's really important in context of your question, Chris, for people to realize that every major civilization prior to this one has gone through a whole process of growth, maturation, corruption, and implosion, either fast or slow. And two really good books that people might want to take a look at are called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed by Jared Diamond, who takes an ecological perspective on this, and another one by Joseph Tainter called The Collapse of Complex Societies, which is a more sociological, anthropological take on it. But both of them present lists of symptoms that suggest a society is approaching that unstable equilibrium when collapse becomes inevitable in response to the next major trauma that it faces. And every one of the major symptoms that each of these authors has described, either ecological or socioeconomic and political, are with us today. So we are, as I think we've already stated, on the verge, if not well into the beginnings of that collapse. We may not feel it here today, but it's being felt elsewhere in the world, and it will catch up to the rest of us inevitably.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of what to do about this stuff, I kind of think, about these incredibly difficult wicked problems, as they're called, and that seem to be intractable and are certainly not anywhere on the horizon of mainstream political discourse. What do you do? And I'm reminded of Albert Camus' great book, The Myth of Sisyphus,
yes,
where he talks about the existential crisis that we all face, which is that we all end in death and nothingness. So what's the meaning of life? Well, you have a certain amount of duty to do the right thing. And the right thing for Sisyphus is to roll the rock up the hill, knowing that it's going to roll right back down every time. And yet he puts his back into it and he keeps on rolling that rock up the hill over and over and over again.
That's the basic life force.
Yes, the basic life force. And I feel like that is what we have to do, even in the face of darkness and wicked problems and seemingly insoluble. Just a wall that we're fast approaching. We still need to maintain a certain positive view that you just got to keep trying. Even though, yes, if collapse is unfolding now, and I think, yes, you're right, and I should have formulated it as it's unfolding now. If collapse is happening, then I don't know. What do you think? What's can you give me some closing thoughts? Give me some closing thoughts.
Yeah,
here.
Christopher, you know, I have hope, but my hope is in wild nature. My hope's in the natural process. You know, we think about the collapse of human. Yeah, human industrial civilization is in fact going to collapse and collapsing now. But life makes life. And life will find a way, and it might not include us, and it's going to be very painful for the human community, the coming contraction. But Earth is going to be here a long time, and you know, in 100 million years, you could have a population of raccoons that have figured out how to make fire and sitting around their campfires.
They're up here in the Catskills.
Yeah,
man.
yeah, they're all over
garbage cans. So I know them.
So my final comment is I trust wild nature, and she'll be all right.
Yeah. Earth. Yeah, Earth first. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much, all of you.
Been a pleasure.
We could go on for several hours, as Bill commented before this started, but we've got to conclude it there. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Nice
you,
to see you
everyone.
guys. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you. Such an informative, thoughtful discussion. Helps us all think about our world and many possibilities for its future. Thank you to the TruthDig audience for your concern for our world and participation in this event. And for more information, come to TruthDig, read Chris's dig, and find more information and resources. And thank you all just so much. Great talk.